Let's talk about picture frames. I'm going to show you a bunch of different picture frames. When I started putting this program together, my initial thought was, well, we've got a lot of picture frames that we did in the magazine, and we've got a lot of moldings that we've done in the magazine. These are a few samples here. This is all on that thumb drive, by the way, that you got in your swag bag, so you can go find all these later. Just search for frames. There's a terrific searchable index that's included on that USB. So this was one article. You can kind of see here, just kind of get a mental picture of some of this, because we're going to see variations on some of this. Was another great article. I thought this is kind of cool. I can do some of these. And there's this one. So there's a variety of frames already in the magazine. So as I started, I thought, well, why should I teach you stuff that you've already going to have the directions to? So what I did was I started riffing off of those frames. I started looking at them going, okay, the idea is to teach you to come up with your own stuff, right? And not just work from a plan, but use your imagination. So that's what I started doing, was using my imagination. I used those 3 articles I just showed you as kind of a basis, and you'll see some variations on those, and you'll see some stuff I just came up with on my own as I was working. We'll try to work through these in I don't know if it's in necessarily increasing order of complexity, but we're going to start with some pretty simple stuff. So I think in your instructions or your handout, you've got the basics on the instructions for all this, what size bits are used and how we put them together. But we'll talk through them. If you guys have any questions as we go, I'll try to answer those. So our first one, and this was actually the first one I did, and I did such a great job on it, you can't even see the joint line. I could not be prouder of a glue up. This is 2 pieces of wood. These are all 3/4 inch thick. That's one thing I tried to limit myself to as I was preparing this. I didn't want to get real exotic. Okay, this one's 5/8 and this one's 9/16 and this one's 1.5 inches. I tried to keep everything at 3/4 of an inch. A few variations here and there, but by and large, if you got 3/4 inch stock, you can make these frames. So this one, we started with outside piece of oak. It's 3/4 inches by 1 inch wide, rounded over the edges, and then routed a shallow rabbet. See where my arrow's going there? That's the joint line. That's the rabbet right there. Nice joint, huh? Yeah. So, and then we've got this other piece here. What's that? 3/4 by 1 also, rounded over one edge, then glued the square edge into there. So why the rabbet? Why not just glue them together? Rabbet helps register one piece against the other. And that's something to keep in mind as you're making moldings for frames. Consistency is your friend. If you're setting up to make a cut on the router table or on the table saw, use feather boards. Even if I can push that across there. The time you take to set up feather boards on the router table, you'd set it up above and beside the bit to make sure you've got consistent pressure down and against the fence. And on the table saw, again, depending on the cut, same orientation, but you wouldn't press against the side of the blade. You'd press up in front of the blade before it makes contact. But the idea is to get that consistent, because you're going to be mitering these pieces, and if they're inconsistent where that joint, if there's variations of thickness, that's where you'll see it, is at the joint. And invariably, you'll miter where things are different. So as you're working, make sure you keep things consistent. The other thing to keep in mind as you're designing frames is the rabbet. You got to make sure you keep enough meat in that inside piece that you can cut a rabbet here to accept the artwork. And you can put often a piece of glass in there, then you'll put your photo or artwork, and then you'll back it up with a piece of cardboard or some hardboard or something to keep it flat, and then put however you're going to hold that in there, turn buttons or whatever. So you have to accommodate that for that rabbet. You don't want to leave a sliver of material here. The size of that rabbet will typically, guideline again, 3/8 by 3/8 is a good size for that. It's going to vary depending on your piece. If you have something that has 3 or 4 layers of mat, you're going to have to go a little bit deeper, right? Because it's going to be that much thicker. If you have just a photograph and it's going to have a piece of 1/8 inch glass photo and a piece of cardboard, then that 3/8 by 3/8 rabbet is probably going to be sufficient, maybe even a little bit too deep. Okay, one other tip on making your moldings. Say you're making an 8 by 10 frame, You need 10 times 2, 8 times 2, so that'd be 20, 30. You need, 36 inches of material? Did I do that math right? Yeah, 30. No, you need about 1.5 times that. Always make 2 pieces of molding, extra pieces of molding, that are at least as long as your longest piece. Again, just covering your butt. Because as you're setting up to make moldings, this goes back to being consistent. If you screw something up when you're putting if you cut just enough and you screw up a piece, now you have to go back, duplicate your setups, and they're not going to be exact. So the new piece will not fit as well with the old pieces. So do yourself a favor. It seems like it might be a little bit of a waste, but you'll thank yourself at some point by having that extra piece of molding sitting there on the bench that you can go to because you cut one too short or something chipped out or whatever. So make yourself some extra molding. Yes, question?
Do you prefer to do longer runs and then cut them, or approximately?
Good question. So his question is, do I prefer to make pieces that are about as long as my finished pieces, or work on one long piece of stock and then chop shorter pieces from it? It depends. You'll find that's my answer to a lot of questions. But here's when I would choose one over the other. If I have a small frame, I'd probably go with the longer stock because it's easier to work with something that say it's 24 inches long or maybe 36, and as opposed to something that might be 6 inches long, trying to route pieces like that. So in that case, for a smaller frame, I'd try to route profiles. Maybe I'd do like a length where I could get 2 pieces out of it, and then I would chop them up. If I had a large frame, and I have a good example of this, I made mirrors for my master bathroom at home, and they're quite large. They're 2 feet by probably 4 feet. So in that case, yeah, there was no way that was a good point. I just cut them about 6 inches over length, give myself a little bit of error room, and routed those profiles before I put those together. Talked about consistency. Oh, also, before you go to assembly your pieces, do all your finish sanding. Goes back to the consistency thing, but also think about these 2 pieces here. You're not going to have much success sanding right where that round over meets that piece if you do it after the glue up. So when the pieces are separate, do all your sanding then. You'll have your final fit, and then put things together. Go easy on the glue, too. We're not building furniture here that's going to be drug across the floor or has to support Aunt Sarah, are we? We are simply making a frame that's going to hang on the wall. Now, as these frames get bigger, like those mirrors I described, glue becomes a little more in alternate joinery methods. We'll talk about that a bit, too. But by and large, when you're assembling moldings like I'm talking about here, building things up, just a narrow strip of glue is all you're going to need. Don't think like you're gluing up a panel where you want those beads of squeeze out to indicate you've got enough glue. If you've got squeeze out on a frame, you're overdoing it because you're going to have to clean that stuff up. And frames are things that get analyzed pretty closely, aren't they? People go up and look at what's in that frame, and they're looking pretty closely at that frame. It's probably one of those things you'll do next to boxes that'll get very closely scrutinized. You get away with a bit of squeeze out on a cabinet, in the lower corner of a door or inside a drawer or something, but on a frame it's going to pop out. So don't overdo the glue. All right. So questions on this one? How this one's assembled? Pretty simple, right? Okay. Let's look at this next one. So I'm kind of taking you through my build process too. Hopefully we can talk about how I inspire some of this. Actually, I could start passing these around, I guess, since you guys can actually take a look and feel what they look like. You get a little different sense sometimes. Next one is our maple with walnut edging. So I got this one done. It's pretty simple. I thought, what else can I do that's really simple but a little more striking? So I went to just a flat piece of maple and trimmed it with walnut on each edge. I like the contrast of that. So to make the walnut, I actually did plane down material here. I had a wider piece. So this is an inch, I believe, on the walnut. That's 3/4. So here I've got 9/16 maple. So here's where I cheated a little bit. And I've got 3/4 walnut, rounded over the edge, ripped off a piece, rounded over the edge, ripped off a piece. So I'm starting with a wider blank here. So again, I'm not starting with that finished. It's much safer to work on a much wider blank. So round it over a piece and rip off. Then glue them in place, and after it's all assembled, come back and cut the rabbet for this piece. The idea here is think about contrasting species. That's a great way to come up with visual interest. Maple, walnut, look around the hardwood store while you're there, see what catches your eye. Let's see, next one is, I'm going to start passing that one around. Hopefully this will get to you guys in the back before we're too deep into it. Yeah, question? Back up one slide. Yes, I can. Yes. Is there a secret to not getting a little bead at the top? So what you're asking is avoiding getting a ridge right down there where the two roundovers meet? Yeah, how to avoid that? Carefully setting your fence. And frankly, a little sandpaper after the fact. Truly. You can minimize it, and if you're lucky, you'll get that perfect setting, and you have zero run out on your router, and it doesn't settle a little bit in the table. I'm not that lucky, so I do the best I can setting that roundover, setting the height, and sometimes even you'll see it kind of hits and skips. Have some places where it was perfect and some places where it wasn't. So little sandpaper takes care of that. And I mean, if we hadn't had this talk, would you have guessed that I'd sanded that to get that? Or would you have guessed that was a roundover? Or are you just looking at it going, that's a pretty nice roundover. So, okay, this one, I like the contrast of the maple and the walnut. I started thinking, okay, what other ways can I make contrast? I thought, well, I could paint something and then tear away some of the paint. So that's all this is. Started with a piece of cherry and spray painted the entire top. In this case, I just used black enamel paint. Enamel, you got to let dry thoroughly because it stays kind of soft. Give it whatever the can says, 24, 48 hours, whatever it says. Give it the full time to dry because otherwise it'll stick to your fingers, it'll tear. So I got this all painted black. And then when it came time to route these roundovers, we got a roundover with a fillet there, smaller roundover with a fillet on the inside. So this is going to be resting on my router table and going across that surface. Like I just said, I don't want to mess up that paint that I just applied. So what I did was taped wax paper to it. Just wrapped it in waxed paper, taped it on the back side here. And then as I'm running that piece across the router table, the wax paper's taken the abuse. Certainly no problem for a router bit to get through the wax paper. It got torn away, sucked up in the dust collector, and my piece came out with the paint intact. So after doing the two roundovers, I set up the table saw and cut a kerf that's just kind of centered on the remaining black field. So I just took a little bit of measuring to figure out, it's not centered on the width of the piece, it's centered on the width of that remaining black field. So just got a little bit of measuring set up there. Then also, you can probably see that that's fine, Paul. You can see a little black edge left there. So as I set up the router table, I wanted to make sure I left a little black edge there. So as you're looking at the frame from the side, again, just gives a little bit of interest. Kind of makes it look a little bit lighter than it really is too. So on with the contrasting species theme, I had a lot of mahogany and the maple that I had worked out pretty nicely. This was a very simple profile. You can even see, here's why you cut extra. Look at that. You got cove, and I chose to photograph this. I should have cut that off. I didn't even notice it until I got the photos back. I'm like, oh, well, it is what it is. So no Photoshop here for you guys, just honest. But it's simple coves on 3 of the edges, and then a kerf plowed down the middle to insert that maple piece. And here, I wanted to also experiment a little bit like I did with the maple and walnut piece on things in different planes. So here we've got that maple inset into a saw kerf. One of the tricks with this is getting a good match between the insert piece and that kerf. So I got lucky, frankly. I just ripped the maple off the edge of a blank and managed to hit it pretty close. I think a better strategy is rip it just a hair wide and then take like a block plane and put just the slightest chamfer on one edge of it. Just what you're doing essentially is making it a little bit wedge shaped. That way you can seat it down in there, and it will seat in that kerf, and you won't have any gaps where the two meet. Here there's a risk of a gap showing somewhere along here, especially after I sand this piece. So I would recommend that strategy with the block plane. You're probably not going to, I mean, if you're not overly aggressive with it, a couple of passes is really all you're going to need. If you're not removing too much material, you won't end up with part of it sitting a little deeper and part of it standing a little prouder. You should end up with a pretty consistent look. And if you get anybody that's taking your picture frames and sighting down them like that, take your picture frame and tell them to leave. So that's the mahogany and maple. The sample you guys have seen these samples, it kind of helps, doesn't it, to see the picture frame and actually get an idea of what the scale is as opposed to just pictures. Yeah, question?
So these presentations are on video.
The presentations? These individual photographs, or the photographs are in your handout.
Right. I saw somewhere where some of this training was also on that.
What you'll have is a copy of the handout. And in fact, off on a tangent here, the handouts for every class are on that thumb drive. So even if you can't get the... It depends on what the teacher provided us. Some of, like this one that I've done is, I think it's in color on the thumb drive. Do you remember, Lucas? I think I made a color PDF. But is there any color in your handouts? I haven't seen the handouts. They're all black and white. I think that my presentation, this particular one, does have a color PDF on the thumb drive. And that's the reason I did it. I think is what you want to know is seeing those contrasts, right? Yeah. We'll talk about that too. We'll talk about that too. They're talking about my joint reinforcement that is showing on the back. And this is again, if somebody's looking at my frames that close at home, I'd ask you to leave. Taking the pictures out of my frames to check the joinery. What are you, some kind of woodworker? Okay, so we had maple with a mahogany accent. Let's kind of reverse that and see what we can do. This one was, I'll be frank with you, with a little bit of a happy accident. Had the maple, made the cove on the interior. I like that cove because it kind of transitions your eye down into whatever's being displayed there. The piece that's proud, I wanted to do a bead because like I talked about earlier from the previous one that had the little maple strip there, I wanted to make sure I didn't have any gaps on this one. So I thought, well, here's a strategy for making sure you don't see any gaps. I'll make the piece that goes into the gap, into the kerf, a little wider, and I'll have shoulders that'll cover any gap. So this is simply a roundover. Now I didn't do this with the beading bit like I talked about originally. This was a roundover bit with a fillet. And my intention was to make a perfectly round profile here. What happened was either I set the bit or it slipped or something. But I ended up with this Gothic peak, which actually I like better. It kind of looked pretty cool. I wish I'd have saved this setup and made more molding like I talked about, because I'd love to recreate this sometime. It can be done easily, but again, it wasn't my intent, but it's how it came out, and I liked it well enough. I thought, well, that's my new design. So here again, the idea I wanted to get across, besides being fortuitous with your accidents, is being able to hide that gap by figuring out how you might have a small shoulder or a narrower piece below that will hide any gap and any squeeze out that might come through too. Yes?
Yeah, do you ever use a shaper to cut any of these shapes that you could do a complete?
He's asking if I ever use a shaper. I don't own a shaper. I don't have room for one. No, I never have. If you have a shaper, yeah, bully for you. Grind a knife to match exactly what you want and do it in one pass. Yeah. Okay. So I guess the other thing I want to mention on making that mahogany accent piece here, I did those roundovers on opposite faces. So I'm working on, again, a wider blank, something that's about, say, 3 or 4 inches wide. I've rounded over the edges, got my shoulders there. Then I took it to the table saw and cut shallow kerfs there to make these shoulders. So those are table saw kerfs, and I've still got material, obviously, along here. And then I raised the blade to cut it free. So that was my procedure on making that. Okay, so there's that one going around. By the way, if you're wondering, these have all been finished with lacquer, just a spray lacquer, rattle can lacquer. That's how I finished all these. And the reason I mention that now is because this next one, I'm really dissatisfied with what lacquer did to it. It did not do what I hoped. But let's talk about the frame first. Again, a little bit of contrast, but I decided I wanted to get a little fancier, get something a little more formal. And I'd had some of this walnut Burl veneer, not a big piece, just small piece sitting around. I thought, I wonder if I can do something with that. So I laminated the veneer onto an MDF substrate. Then obviously MDF doesn't have very pretty edges, so you got to cover it with something. And so I ripped off a thin maple strip to go on the outside, and then did my bead profile here and ripped that free from my wider blank, and then glued that on the other opposite side so everything is flush on the top. Now my hope was that when I applied the lacquer, I'll pop it over here to you, Paul, so they can see this up close. I was hoping when I applied the lacquer that that grain would pop, but it went to hell. I was disappointed. But frankly, I was kind of deep into this and didn't have time to sand it down and hit it with an oil or something, see how that might treat it. But the lesson to learn here is a little experimentation ahead of time pointed to a problem that I would have had finishing this. I would not make a whole frame. This is a good idea. Save some scrap, try your finish on it, find out if the finish is going to work before you attack the entire frame. So more veneer. So I had this piece of MDF with my nice walnut Burl veneer. Still had some strips left over after making that sample. Thought, all right, let's take it up a little bit. So I decided to make what I considered kind of a Victorian-looking frame. So this is that MDF. I've got it sandwiched between two pieces of cherry. It was a thicker cherry. That one was, inch and a quarter, or 13/16 thick. And I think the only reason for the extra 16th there is because I stopped planing a little too early. I think I mismeasured, so it's not intentionally 13/16. But what it did give me is, I think, just a little bit more of that field there, which is fine. It worked out fine. So this could be 3/4. You have just a little bit narrower field there. So identical pieces on either side kind of gave me a nice depth on it that we kind of haven't seen yet in any of the other samples that have come around. So same thing with that veneer. You'll see the lacquer did it no favors whatsoever. So I did this kind of, I don't know, I'm not really Victorian, but a little more Victorian type of look, and I thought I need something modern to kind of balance out the portfolio here. Something not too embellished. So I decided, well, I haven't done anything. I've done contrast. It's really visible from the sides and things. Had the oak and the maple here, so I laminated some pieces of oak and maple, and then just chamfered the inside here so that the chamfer ends right where the maple and the oak interior meet there. And then went over the router table, and my question here on doing this one was, I wonder if using a cove or a core box bit, which has a rounded profile on the end, instead of a straight bit, I wonder if that shadow will look any different, if it might have like a smoother transition instead of having that sharp wall at the bottom, if that would make any difference. The answer, no. But I tried it out. So just I think an 1/8 inch core box here and a 1/4 inch core box there, done just enough to get into the maple, get the full radius of that core box bit into the maple. So you can see they're different depths, but I went deep enough again to get that full radius in there. So this one looks a little bit nicer. I think it came out pretty well. It gives you some interest from the side because you got that lamination where the maple and the oak, if you're looking at it from the side before you get around to see the picture in front. See how we're doing on time. We're all right. So that's kind of our modern piece here. After doing those two channels there, I thought, well, let's go back to filling those channels. So you can see here we've got a bead routed on the outside edge. Did my two channels here. Apparently I still had the core box bit in the router table. You can see there's a little gap down there. Worked out just fine. Nobody's ever going to see that once you get the piece put together. So just routed a shallow kerf at the router table, and then using this is the exact same bead we saw earlier on that maple and walnut piece that's going around. I had some of that left over. So this went on the outside edge there, and I think kind of works the opposite of some frames where it kind of climbs from the outside up instead of slanting down toward the pieces being displayed. And then once we got the stain on it, and then I left it out in the sun to get some aged cherry on it, it ended up looking, I think, pretty nice. Nice contrast between the maple and the, oh, you know, there's one thing I wanted to mention. Where's the, that one there, the mahogany with the maple inlay? Maybe you've noticed those two pieces of maple are markedly different, aren't they? So that's one where frankly, I was just making a prop for class, so I put those two pieces together. If I was making a frame, I'd examine that a little more closely, make sure those colors match at that corner before putting those together. So now everything is so far kind of been flat, and the next thing I wanted to experiment with was doing a bit of an angle. Had something that kind of angled out from the back of the frame, kind of stood proud a little more. So what I came up with was taking a piece of cherry, this is where this started, routing a 1/4 inch cove on that edge. Then I did a bevel rip. So this edge here is bevel ripped at this table saw with the cove up 15 degrees. Then I took it over and started nibbling away at this little rabbet again. This is to, again, register those two pieces together so my molding is consistent. Now you might think the easiest way to do this is with a dado blade. But what I found is by making progressive passes with a single blade, starting at this point and working out until I had just a sliver here and then stopping. So again, I've got, as I'm working the table saw, this is supporting the piece, and on that last pass, there's a little sliver left out here that's still supporting the piece. Then I remove that last sliver with a chisel. But I found that working with a single blade and making multiple passes like that makes this more consistent, makes this angle more consistent with this, more closer to parallel. If you had a dado blade set up, well, part of your blade is higher at one point of the table than it is at the other, so that will change this angle here. Nothing wrong with that, but if you want this piece to be flat like I did, you'd have to then change the bevel here to accommodate whatever your dado blade cut. So by nibbling away with just a single blade, we kept this reasonably close to parallel with the outside edge. Then another 15-degree cut where my blade was already set, and I've got a bevel here that nests very nicely. Now you notice this because of nibbling away with that single blade, I've got some ridges here. It's not a perfect joint. But again, we're not building furniture here. We're not gluing up a panel. I don't care. I took a chisel to that and kind of knocked off the worst of the ridges, sanding block to take care of a little bit of the rest, and there was plenty of glue surface there to keep these two pieces together. So there's walnut with our cherry trim. Then I got to thinking, how about some other inlay materials? And this one I actually had to make a whole frame for to show you the effect. This is a walnut frame. The frame itself couldn't be simpler. It's square. But what I wanted to do was try inlaying some different materials. And this is just aluminum bar stock that I got at the home center. So I just let me switch over here. Well, I think I'd do it up here. Put the frame together, or I'm sorry, I milled all my pieces to size. And then what I had to do here was actually cut my frame pieces to length, to finished length, because I had to know the finished length to find the positioning for these aluminum pieces here, because I was measuring from a corner to locate those. So I have all my pieces cut to length, then just angling the miter gauge 45 degrees to match the miters on the corner, and I measured out and then just cut to a mark. I didn't use any kind of indexing on this. I just marked where I wanted them and then cut to the mark on both sides. And then put aluminum bar stock. I think, it comes in a flat bar. I ripped some pieces on the saw earlier, and then glued those in so they're standing proud. I used epoxy on this. You'll be able to see the epoxy pretty clearly as this comes around. So you'll be able to see there's small little areas here where I was a little less than perfect, and the epoxy is visible, primarily because I used a dark epoxy. In hindsight, the better choice would be a clear epoxy. Find something that dries clear, isn't going to draw attention to itself. I think you could use this frame in just about any orientation. It looks pretty good in that orientation. I think that makes pretty nice action going one way. And this one, I saw this orientation and thought, ooh, Mount Fuji. Doesn't that work pretty well? I mean, that mirrors the lines of the mountain pretty well, doesn't it? And had I known Mount Fuji was going to go in here, I might have actually put them at the top to echo the mountain a little better. But it also, it works in that direction too. Get something moving left to right. You got a sports car, you're an archer, you got the quills of your arrow. A lot of things with that little frame. So every frame you've seen so far has been mitered, hasn't it? That's not the only joint that you can use to join pieces in a square fashion to make a frame. So the last frame I want to show you here is really kind of a hybrid. It's just using half-lap joinery. But I use this one example to show 3-4 different ways of applying a half-lap joint. So at the top, I've got a half-lap joint, but you can see it's flush, the style's flush with the rail, and the rail stands proud. Down here at the bottom, we've got just the opposite, kind of a Lincoln log look here, where both the rail and the style stand proud of each other. Where typically when you think of a half lap, everything's flush on the ends. The corners are flush, the edges are flush with the faces, so everything, just like a regular frame, will be flush. Doesn't necessarily have to be that way, does it? The other thing I did here was I didn't cut my half lap so the faces were perfectly flush, which is what you would typically do. You could have a half lap that exactly half the depth of your workpiece, and things will be flush all the way around. So this one, you've just got the pieces standing a little bit proud. I think gave it a little bit more character. I wanted to see what it looked like, and I thought it turned out pretty well. This would be great for a rustic, you got your prize trophy buck, put him in there. I did not route a rabbit around the back of this one, just because, time being what it is sometimes. But for the purpose of the class, I wanted to see that half laps can be a perfectly good joint for your frames too, and exceptionally strong. Well, big frames, half lap gives you tons of glue surface, face-to-face glue surface, so it's a real good choice. In my basement, I've got a big frame that I made. It's probably 4 foot by 4 foot. It's a couple of National Geographic maps of the U.S. that I got from my dad. They're just mounted on spray foam. It's not a big deal, but it's a big frame. And I just wanted a frame that was going to stay square and was easy to put together, so I used half-lap joints to put that one together. And the thing to be aware of course, is you're going to have end grain showing somewhere. Just choose whether you want it at the top or at the sides. And typically, if you put it at the top and the bottom, it's a little less visible. So let's talk a little bit about, since we're talking about reinforcing the joints, finding some strong joinery. Someone mentioned earlier about the little biscuit you could see inside those miters. That's a perfectly acceptable way to put together a frame. Some of these smaller frames, though, you're going to see they're too small for biscuits. I think most everything I put together, if I recall, there might be an exception or two, but I used a mini biscuit jointer. I've got a Ryobi mini biscuit jointer. I'm not even sure if they make it anymore. But a good substitute is to get a slot cutter bit, and it'll cut, get something that cut about a 1/4 inch slot, and use that to cut, as you would a biscuit jointer, to cut small slots in there. Then you can make your own biscuits using 1/4 inch plywood or whatever 1/4 inch scrap you have lying around. It takes a little bit of effort to make those, but I mean, if you're only making 4, or if you're making even if you're making 5 frames, you only have to make 20 of them and make them fit. Another tactic, we know you've probably seen splines in miter joints. That one's common enough. I'm not even going to mention that, but you can do it on the table saw. This is another little method. When you're using miter joints, you don't want to use a spline. You got something that's too narrow to get a biscuit in. Flip over the back, get a Forstner bit, drill a shallow hole, and then glue in a piece of whatever you got laying around. In this case, it's hardboard, but a better choice would be hardwood. Something that's, not this could delaminate, but this is going to be a strong joint. This is going to last. So that's an option too. Get your Forstner bit out and drill a reinforcement for your miters. Splines, when you're cutting a spline down the joint itself, you get a nice accent piece there. But you can choose to make it an accenting wood. So if I was going to put mahogany in a maple piece like this, or if I want to kind of make it a little more subtle, make the splines out of the same species. So you have maple on maple, for example. And what you get there is just a kind of a subtle effect from the differences in the wood grain that give you a real subtle accent. That's pretty much what I've got lined up for you today. If there are questions, I'd be happy to answer those, and I'll also be sticking around a little bit after class here to answer questions.